introduce to you Sammy, because I've been told I could call him that. But he is also very known. He's an internationally known presenter. And I guarantee you, you will not be sorry for being here tonight. So please, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and help me to welcome to the podium, Samuel Betances. As they say in showbiz, break a leg, Sammy.
Half a day. Greetings. Saludos. I am happy to be here. Early experiences determine brain structure and thus shape the way we learn, think, and behave for the rest of our lives. We're born with a heart, with our lungs, with our eyes, with our brains, but the brain is the only component that is not developed when you're born. It's waiting to be made smart. And what we put in the brain and what the brain receives determines the way we view the world, we view ourselves, and we think. And so it's in that spirit that I am very happy that the Micronesian Area Research Center, MARC, as we lovingly call it, has invited me to participate in this seminar on this January the 9th of 2018. I work with my wife and my boss and my partner, Laura Sauter, Dr. Sauter, and we have a company called Sauter, Betances, and Associates. And what we do as, in our work is that we provide technical assistance and diversity intelligence for organizations that want to be more effective in achieving their mission. We are associates of MARC. So it's in that spirit that we have merged our passion for what we do professionally, which is to provide diversity intelligence training so that people can develop their competencies to respond and relate and try to solve the challenges and problems in Guam and the Micronesian area, region in generally. So that's what you see up there. Cross-cultural perspectives on strength-based trauma-informed care in Guam and Micronesia is what we will be talking about. And in that context, let me just go ahead and suggest what are going to be some of our learning goals. Your ACE score, keep in mind your ACE score, your adverse childhood experiences, ACE, and your ALE score, your adverse labeling experiences. ALE, that is the way that you are viewed, and if you belong to a group, the way that you are labeled and stigmatized and stereotyped. Those determine the way you view the world. Those determine the way you view the world. Those determine the way you relate to people around you. And if your ACE score is very high, you will experience trauma. And so it's in that spirit that I want to introduce you to your ACE score system so that you can determine what your ACE score is, and introduce you to the ALE paradigm to determine a little bit about your score there, and hopefully appreciate how trauma-informed care is essential when people have experienced rejection, when people have experienced marginalization, when people have experienced political suppression, when people have experienced abuse, whether it is sexual or whether it is physical or emotional or neglect. So it's in that context that I want you to keep in mind your scores, the ACE score and the ALE score, and then we need to explore under what circumstances might we on Guam and Micronesia figure out a way to provide the kind of care that is sensitive, informed, and strength-based in order that people who have experienced some kind of oppression, some kind of a victimization, are able to thrive, to start, to become resiliency, to bounce back. And so that those are going to be the learning goals. Sir William Osler said, it is more important to know what sort of a patient has a disease than what sort of a disease a patient has. And let me illustrate. When Mamacita is the way we lovingly refer to Loling's mom and her family, when she was ill, we took her overseas to the States in Chicago, where Lo and I were working at the time, and we went to a hospital, Swedish Covington Hospital. And Debbie, her daughter, flew in from Hawaii. Buddy was there, the nieces, the nephews, everybody was there. Lo was there. We were all there with Mom. She was sick. We could not add days or weeks or years to her life, but we could add life to her years and days. And it's in that context that we were in the hospital when we heard the announcement, visiting hours will be over in 15 minutes. And we went about our business taking care of Mom. And when the time came for the visiting hours to be over, people left. We stayed. And the staff kind of sort of began to look at us a little bit weird. Visiting hours are over. And Lo says, we are not visiting. We're taking care of Mom. In our culture, 24 hours a day when possible, we are present in that's what our culture requires. And consequently, we're not visitors. We're part of the force that provides trauma-informed care during the crisis. And they didn't know how they didn't know what to do with us. They have this little room with the TV, with sports, and then they have these magazines that doctors tear out their names and then they leave in the office for people to read. And it wasn't particularly hospitable because they were taking care of people that did not come from Guam, that did not come from Micronesia, that did not have those kinds of experiences. So the way we intervene in the lives of our people is through cultural competencies. So it is more important to know what sort of a patient has a disease than what sort of a disease a patient has. It has to do with the food intake, whether you worship in a particular way, whether you can take blood, on and on and on and on. And so one of the challenges that we face when we find that our people are experiencing pain and perhaps oppression is to figure out what is the most culturally competent way that we might respond to their needs by providing trauma-informed care that is strength-based. What is the ACE study? Well, it's a research study that took place, Kaiser Permanente and the Center for Disease Control, somewhere in the late 90s. They were taking, people were coming in for their physicals, and they volunteered to respond to a survey. And the survey had to do with adverse childhood experiences. What happened to you as a child? And your score will be determined by 10 factors. And it basically, let me see, it looks something like this. On the one hand, if you have experienced abuse, and there were 3 types of abuse: emotional, physical, or sexual. So if you experience any of those, each one is worth 1 point. Then there are household challenges. Did somebody from your family go to prison? Was there a divorce and a tug of war where your parents are pulling you one way or the other? Did you experience domestic violence taking place in your presence? Did you witness somebody being hurt that way? Was somebody drunk or drug dependent in your house? Did you have somebody in your family with some kind of a mental problem? And so in that context, each of those is 1 point, and that is part of your ACE score. And the last piece at the extreme end is neglect. Have you experienced emotional neglect or physical neglect? Now here's what they found out, which was very fascinating. The higher your score, your ACE score, the greater your chances of becoming addicted. The greater your chances of coming to terms with the fact that the world is not a safe place in which to live. The more you then try to take a leave of absence from reality. We take drugs, legal or otherwise, to take a leave of absence from reality. And eventually those drugs get us addicted. But it's not only drugs. You can do gambling, you can do shoplifting, you can do risky sexual behavior because you were not loved, you're looking for love. If you were raped, it is possible that you might think that your body made you attractive to a rapist, so you could begin to eat and balloon out and become obese so that you're not attractive to somebody. Or you might decide to do it the other way around, where you practically starve yourself. Or you can go into a shopping binge. Or you can do any number of things, like in religion, where you become totally fanatical about your belief systems. In Orlando, when there was a shooting in a gay club, I remember that some pastors, evangelical pastors from Puerto Rico, made the statement that the shooter didn't kill enough of them. So it is very possible that we have these views that they are not healthy. If you have been injured, if you have been abused, if you have been neglected, if you have grown up in an environment where you have seen these horrible things take place to the people around you, you then escape from that reality by becoming addicted and dependent and becoming a health problem for the society. And that's what the ACE score says. The higher your ACE score, the shorter your life. The higher the ACE score, the bigger the fall into the pit of dependency. And it's in that spirit that we have that. So failure to have a positive experience with people leads victims of trauma to seek negative attachments to addictions or other self-destructive behavior. So what are you attached to? That largely depends on whether you have people that love you or people that abuse you. And if the people abuse you, then you tend to follow this pyramid, where you will find that your adverse childhood experience messes up your brain. It disrupts your neurodevelopment, your social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risks, behavior, disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. If you have a high score, the research indicates that you're likely to die 20 years sooner than those with a low score or a zero score. Often victims have no other option but to remain in the nexus of their trauma. So if you're abused and you can't hold a job, you then come to live in the very home where you have experienced abuse. So in a sense, you're stuck. You can't get away from the reality. And in that context, a toxic home where their ACE score climbs, pushing them further into dysfunctional addiction. Here's the way Dr. Nadine Harris Burke put it.
Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, Your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging.
What if the bear comes home every night? What if, as a child, you see your parents fighting? What if, as a child, you see somebody drunk? What if you have somebody in your family who's not mentally healthy? What happens if somebody is abusing you sexually? And the bear comes home every night. What happens is that your brain gets distorted because you either want to fight or flee, but you can't. So you're immobilized and you are impaired in your brain. So when you go to confession and you find that you're not following the guidance of your parents, and you tell the priest, if you happen to be a Catholic, that you're not getting along with one of your parents because something's going on in that home that keeps you from wanting to respect people who abuse you. And the priest says, try to do better. Try to be nicer. And say a couple of Hail Marys. In other words, if we are not informed as to why people do the things they do, we then have these little formulas that we parachute out of a reality that is absent from the culture and the reality of why it is that people are troubled. So if your ACE score is very high, you tend to do destructive things that get you in trouble with your teachers. So you're not interested in studying because your trauma is very high. You're not interested in, if your authority person is abusing you, you don't respect authority. So you might get in trouble with the police. And above all else, you start taking drugs so that you can pursue some kind of pleasure that brings you comfort away from the painful reality that the bear is coming home every night and messing up your brain. So in that spirit, we have to ask ourselves, how do we relate to our children here on Guam? How do we relate to our parents? And how do we relate to those that are in trouble? So every area of human functioning, physical, mental, behavioral, social, spiritual, all of that is threatened. And alcohol and drug abuse alone have estimated $161 billion of costs. I was recently lecturing at Princeton University, and I found out something very interesting. It costs more in New Jersey to attend 1 year, to be in prison for 1 year in New Jersey than to attend 1 year at Princeton. So it's extremely costly. And so we have to figure out, how do we work at this? Keeping in mind that when you send your child to a recovery program, they disconnect you from your addiction, but they don't necessarily give you a solution to deal with your trauma. So you then are detoxed, and then you come back home. And the bear comes home every night. So in a sense then, our challenge has a lot to do with the fact that this is how we get a high A score. Now the problem with the study, the A study that was done by Kaiser Permanente and the Center for Disease Control, is that they basically asked people who are largely European Americans, some African Americans, but largely European Americans, few Hispanics, but largely European Americans, and all of privilege with college degrees and with benefits. And as a result of that, we are grateful because that study has told us that people from well-to-do backgrounds, that people from a privilege also experience oppression, experience trauma, experience injury, experience abuse, experience neglect. But what they did not do, and this is important for us to do in Micronesia, this is important for us to do on Guam, and this is something that needs to be done in the United States, is they did not take into account those of us that experience adverse labeling experiences, the ALE, fueled by destructive isms like racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism and ageism and stigma, driven by macro and microaggressions and political suppression, colonialism. So in that context, the A score doesn't tell the whole truth, especially for Micronesians, because we don't control our destiny. We don't control. There was a group of people that came one day and told us that the indigenous language, which connects you to your culture and gives you worth and gives you continuity of peoplehood, that the language is no good. So now you take the language of the people that tell you that your language is no good, which then you take that language and you take those values and you then experience the trauma of becoming practically a stranger in your own homeland because you do not belong. You are now a product of a culture that is alien and anti your own culture. So in that context, we find that colonialism, political suppression, racism. So if you come from a people that have experienced slavery, or if you come from a people that have experienced a political occupation, or if you come from a people that have experienced all of those kinds of isms, that stays with you. And in that spirit, as with AIDS, victims with high ALE scores experience feelings of rejection, internalized shame, fear, anger, and a sense of powerlessness. This has been abundantly documented in research studies. So take me, for example. I am really well accomplished. My A scores were very high. I have buried my 6 brothers. My father was an alcoholic. My brother went to prison and died of violence. Another one died of AIDS. I was sexually abused as a child. I came home one day and there was nobody home. So just imagine, you're 13 years old, you go to school, you come home, and there's nobody home. I have 9 scars in my body. I grew up on welfare. My mom white, my daddy black, so I suffered the stigma of racism and poverty and colonization. And I found somebody who got into my face and basically said, Sammy, God does not make junk. You need to reject rejection. You have strengths. You are intelligent but unskilled. The problem is that you need to read, and the words that were middle class that your parents couldn't give you, you got to get from books and from the dictionary. And so I found this Japanese American woman who guided me with trauma-informed care. and guided me with my strengths. And as a result of that, I started to read, and I stayed away from destructive behaviors. And while I have buried my 6 brothers and could not find a good connection to my people and my relatives in Puerto Rico, I happened to come to Guam and find a family that welcomed me, and found my best friend who's loved me. And together we now have returned to Guam, where I continue to experience a tremendous amount of affirmation, even though in my insides there's still injuries caused by all of that remains inside of you. Because when somebody violates you, I tell you, it's very, very difficult. So ill victims are at greater risk of perpetrating and or being subject to psychological, sexual, and physical abuse, engaging in destructive addictions and risky behaviors, performing poorly in school and work, living in poverty, and remaining politically disempowered. So here's what happens to us in Micronesia. We have, on the one hand, the A score that everybody has, the abuse, the neglect, the household challenges that we talked about, the 10 points. And then we have the ALE paradigm, ableism, classism, genderism, colonialism, languageism, racism, religionism. So when you are categorized and stereotyped and stigmatized and viewed as not as important. I mean, here I am in going to work for General Motors, to do training for General Motors and the McDonald's Corporation. And I'm in Tokyo, and I'm about to get into my airplane at the level of the business class. And there's a gentleman from the airlines, and I won't mention the airline because I don't want to embarrass United or anybody else. It got nothing to do with the airline. I have over 8 million miles with the airlines, and United has most of them, and I love the service that I get. But here's this man. He's looking at me, walking towards the business section, and I look like a handkerchief. I don't look like a flag to him. Japanese man. What is your name? I said, you're in luck. I know my name. What is your seat number? Bingo. You hit the jackpot. I also know my seat number. Now please get out of my way. And what happened to him is that he was normally racist. Like some of us are normally sexist. And to some degree, you're always on the spotlight of doubt. And we have people in our islands who live on the spotlight of doubt every day. So not only are they experiencing ACE trauma, they're experiencing societal trauma, and they both gang up on us, and we have some serious problems that have to do with health and otherwise. So how is that manifested in our communities? Suicide, the 5th leading cause of death on Guam. And by the way, most of them under age 30. Family violence was the top charge offense in the Guam Superior Court in 15, 16, and 14. It has been documented. Obesity on Guam is well above the world and national average. So based on 2010 stats, Guam has a diabetes prevalence rate of 11, making this condition the 4th leading cause of death on our island. And then in Palau, domestic violence and other issues related. And then in Yap, we also realize that that's a big problem, alcoholism and violence in that area. Where does all of that come from? And what impact does it have? And by the way, this is not the responsibility of the professionals. The professionals are important. The therapists are important. The psychiatrists are important. The caretakers are important. But also the clergy. Also those of us who are educators. And those of us who basically have resources. And it's in that spirit. Chuukese constitute 11% of Guam's population. They represent 47% of the youth population at the youth DYA and similar rates, Department of Corrections. So that here is a group of people, through no fault of their own, the United States says to them, don't make a deal with China or with the Soviet Union, and you could have access to the American system. Without your passport, you can come to the United States. And to them, the United States is Guam and Hawaii, mostly, and other places. So they come, and within 30 days, they qualify for certain things, that's handouts and so forth and so on. And they don't know the language necessarily. And they have a culture that is different than ours, and they may dress significantly different. And so as a result of the fact that we don't have control over immigration, and they don't have any control either, all of a sudden we find ourselves in trouble and in conflict. By the same token, just remember that 30% or more of the student bodies on Guam are from Chuukese. So over 30% of our people have jobs in education because of the Chuukese. But we see them as a problem. And so to some degree, that's an issue. B.J. Cruz basically said, Senator Cruz, while nothing can excuse family violence, Guam's homes are exposed to a crosswind of economic, social, and cultural pressures. Unless we learn the right emotional and psychological tools necessary to cope, unjustifiable violence can become the sad symptom of deeper problems. So here we have it. We have the factors that amplify each other: abuse, neglect, and household challenges, and then all of the isms that are around. So healing from physical, emotional, psychological, social, and spiritual crisis is greatly impacted by the interaction between these two factors, these two sources. And we just can't say to people, get over it. It has taken 20, 30, and 40 years for people that experience sexual abuse in our island to finally feel somehow that it is safe to come and to relate to that. And you can see them 30 years later crying because these are unresolved issues. Because in our island, we cannot afford to betray our family members who do this stuff. Everybody's related to everybody. So there's a conspiracy of silence sometimes. But saying just because your ACE score is very high or low and you have privilege, you can, just get over it. That happened 20, 30 years ago. Mom, why didn't you stop him? Well, sweetheart, I was young, inexperienced, and I didn't want him to leave me, and I wasn't there. But just get over it. It doesn't work that way. We have to provide trauma-informed care.
You know, we've been hearing a lot about trauma, but also what I've also learned over the years in trying to provide help for boys and girls and men and women is we have to approach them differently and understand the gender differences. And today, as we're learning more about our transgendered population, also understanding what it means for someone to be transgendered in our society. And where we see the gender differences when we look at males and females is when we look over the lifespan. So this morning we're hearing a lot about children, about boys and girls. We know they're both at risk for physical and sexual abuse as well as other kinds of traumatic events. And their greatest risk is from people they know. But if we begin to see a difference when we move into adolescence, in teenage years for a boy, if he's a young man of color, if he's gay, if he belongs to a gang, his risk for harm actually comes from people who dislike him. And I want to contrast that to the teenage girl whose greatest risk comes from her relationships, from the person to whom she's saying, I love you. If we move into adult life, for a man who serves in the military, his greatest risk for harm comes from the enemy. If he lives in our communities, in the free world, his greatest risk for harm comes by being a victim of crime committed by a stranger. But for a woman, if she serves in the military, her greatest risk for harm comes from the men she's serving with. And if she's living in our communities, in the free world, her greatest risk for harm comes from her relationships. It's very unusual for us to work with an adult male who was harmed in his childhood by someone he was in a relationship with, who was harmed in his adolescence by someone he was in a relationship with, and then was harmed in his adult life by someone he was in a relationship. An unusual scenario for a male, a common scenario for a female. And this has implications when we talk about providing services.
Understanding gender differences matter. You're likely to be injured if you are female by somebody who says they love you. If you're a male, you're likely to be injured by a stranger. And therefore, the way we relate to this issue becomes super, super important. A non-trauma informed system basically says, what's wrong with you? An informed system says, what happened to you? I was mentoring a former student of mine who was an alcoholic and a drug addict, and eventually came to make amends after he took the 12-step program. And interestingly enough, I did it wrong. I didn't have the competencies that I have today. I used to say to him, Miguel, you have a college degree, you speak 2 languages, you're relatively good looking, you have a car, you have American citizenship, you have a passport. Get over it, get with it. He says, my father would beat my mother every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday. When he discovered that she had been unfaithful. And we were all tiny little kids, and we experienced the beatings for years and years and years, and it messed up our minds. The bear came home every night, and instead of me saying, Miguel, what happened to you? I would say, just get disconnected from your booze, you'll be okay. And one day he got disconnected from his booze, came home, and began to drink at the level that he used to drink before he stopped drinking, and he got alcohol poisoning, and he died 2 years ago. So, to some degree, we need to stop blaming the victims. What's wrong with you? Why don't you get over it? Why don't you begin this important process of recovery? Get a hold of yourself. Stop blaming others. Strength-based trauma-informed care is an evidence-based intervention that works. The strength perspective demands different way of looking at individual families and communities. And so in that context, Mary Yamasaki was able to look at me and say, you're intelligent, you got a good work ethic, but you don't have the words that are essential. Give me permission, authorize me to tell you what no one else will tell you. And I authorized her, and as a result of that, I was able to graduate alone. No one from my family came. And then graduate again and again, and in the context became successful. This does not mean giving a pass to dysfunctional behavior. Rather, it represents a positive, holistic approach. So here, my last moment. Here are some strategies to consider. Change the narrative. Stop somehow telling children that it is okay to be disconnected from their language. Stop telling your daughters that she has to go and she got married and divorce is not acceptable, and so she has to stay in a place where the bear comes home every night. Stop simply enabling someone who's addicted, but work with that person and through their strengths to reinvent themselves. I found that I could not have a good relationship with my mother or my father. I had an excellent relationship with Lo's mom and dad and with her sibs and family, and I have an excellent relationship with her. So we need to attach people, but based on their strength. We need to attach them, engage in positive strength-based relationship. Lastly, some of us worship in communities, and there are parking spaces, and there are toilet facilities, and there's climate control, and our children during the summer have no place to go. And while the elite can take their children overseas and they continue to learn and spring forward, the children from poverty do not get an education. If you want to improve the health of our island, make sure that our children are continuing to build their word power, their reading power, their study power, their critical thinking powers. So let's go ahead and give them the opportunity to do so. Volunteer. Get out of your comfort zones. And be willing to step out of your comfort zones and be inconvenienced. Remain hopeful. Healing is possible. As practitioners or community advocates and leaders who may not have high ACE L score, develop your cultural competencies. Read resiliency memoirs. If you preach, if you talk, if you teach, read resiliency memoirs about people who bounce back from their adversity. And in that context, you'll have illustrations to help people heal instead of escaping from reality, to transform themselves, because today simply will be the first day of the rest of their lives. And if you don't read, you can't lead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stanley. We have 15 minutes or so for question and answer. Would anybody like to address the speaker? If I have a question. We have microphones on both sides of the aisle.
Hello. So like in many oppressed communities, including our own and like the African American community, it seems to me that the trauma from ACE creates this self-perpetuating vicious cycle. Many communities look externally to break the cycle, but I believe that the cycle needs to be broken from within the communities. But that's hard to do because the cycle is self-perpetuating. So can you talk about maybe strategies at kind of breaking that cycle down and repeating itself?
Tom Burrell has written a book called Brainwash that is amazing. We were engaged in a conference recently in Chicago. And basically, he talks about why, for example, in the African American community, the folks there, we do not always trust each other, seek assistance, and learn to collectively take actions to remove obstacles that are in our path. So one of the things that I have done with one of my nephews that I love very much, and he's like my grandson now, Matthew and I read together. I have a book on how to turn bad study habits into good study habits, and we read out loud and we talk about our strategies. And I've done that with my nephew in Chicago, who didn't have a father that could give him those kinds of things. So I would say, get together with somebody and have a reading discussion groups and read out loud and say, and what have we learned and how can we apply it? I think that's one strategy that we can learn from the experiences of others who bounce back. Resiliency is the way to go. Brainwash, for example, Brainwash. And there's an amazing book by Tom Burrell. And then at the end, I will give you my email. And if you need to have resources, we will make them available to you. But that book is amazing.
Neighbor, Mike Burns. So the penny got me when you said somebody got in my face. That's when I said, that's it. And you know, you continued on in that direction. So I am a leader on the island. Can you give me tips on how to multiply people like your mentor?
Yes. I believe that, well, Lo and I, we have a plan. We meet with people and we can assist creating leadership toolkits on how to intervene. We call it intrusive intervention. How to participate in intrusive intervention to cause people to do that kind of work. And the beautiful thing is that we are back on our island. We have retired from our jobs, but not from our vocations. And in that spirit, you call us and you bring a group of 20 or 10 or 12 people, and we can start with that group. And I'd be happy to start a ministry by going to the youth detention center, for example. But I remember that lady, Christian lady with her long, tiny, long, bony finger got in front of my face and basically says, "Young man, you are intelligent but unskilled." And I wrote about it in my book. It's basically called Crossing a Bridge Called Books. So to answer your question, Bishop, we can do it, and we'd be happy to do it, and we're hungry to do it, and we're available to do it, and it will be part of our ministry with yours.
Hi, Dr. Betances over here.
Oh, gotcha.
So I'm looking at the L's and how colonialism is put under that bracket, and languages and racism as well, which all are so connected to colonialism. And one of the things that I'm thinking about as you speak with, I'm thinking of, say like my parents' generation is post-war children, and I've noticed that with many, there's sometimes, I guess because buying into the colonization narrative is denying that you have been oppressed, denying that you are a victim of classism, languagism, or racism, and even internalizing some of the oppressive rhetoric used against them. And so I'm wondering, in helping people with high L scores who have colonialism in that bracket, what are some ways that we can dismantle that deep belief that they are maybe not victims, or the unwillingness to look at that? Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Bryan Stevenson has written a book called Mercy. And it's a fascinating, he says, change the narrative. Stop telling Americans that when the Europeans came here, the continent was empty. Stop telling people in the Pacific that they have been discovered. Stop telling people, it's amazing that on Guam, in Puerto Rico, on the Virgin Islands, in Samoa, in the Mariana Islands, on the 4th of July, you celebrate the day that the United States of America said colonialism is no good. So we're going to celebrate it in the colony. Now, I am not suggesting that you become a single issue activist, nor am I suggesting that people who have that mindset are our enemies. What I am suggesting is that when people around you feel strongly about the fact that they feel fenced out of their own homeland, that they're not crazy, that they want somehow to better their lot. And so colonialism, there's a wonderful book by Jim Wallace called Faith Works. Jim Wallace, Faith Works. And he says that the two original sins in the United States was stealing the land from the indigenous and bringing people and enslaving them and making them work for nothing. We have made hatred sacred. Pope Francis says at the cross, Jesus redefined the meaning of service. So the cross for Christians, whether you're Protestant or Catholic, The cross represents sacrifice and God breaking into human history to give us as Christians another chance, a second chance. Do you know that in some areas of the United States of America, when you want to express hatred against black people, what do you burn? The cross. So we have made hatred sacred by burning the cross to express rejection. So we're not crazy, but we got to be very, very careful that we do not make it a profession to become champions of a particular point of view that then cause injury to those that we're trying to help become freer, stronger, and healthier. So don't, sexism is real. Oppression is real. But we must do what we must. And as an educator, it's my responsibility to help people develop a critical mindset so that they're able to add value to our society and our region and our worship communities. But I am embarrassed by the fact that we do not do enough for those with fewest alternatives to thrive, except it be through informed traumatic care. And it's in that process that I think we need to make coalitions of interest, not coalitions of color. There's a...
We have a question.
No, Cesar Rossi, Dr. Betances and Zainab for coming back to Guam.
Raise your hand. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Yes.
Although, we have been using Dr. Betances and sign law to give our teachers professional development. But I believe now, after I saw all the bears coming home as educators, I know we have a lot of teachers here tonight, but also we have parents. So I believe that every child, most of our children, 30,000 for the Guam Department of Education, they have bears coming home to their home. So as parents, not as teachers, no matter how we go through a lot of professional development, and the bears still come home to connect the teaching and learning for each children. So I want to advocate parents here that are teachers and other parents, so that maybe you can give a talk to our parents in our school system. If some of those parents are the bears of today. Cesar Rossi.
Thank you very much. We need to work at creating reading clubs, growing our intelligence, and remember this. Here's the trick. We talk about the reason, the reason for the season. From the Christian point of view, is basically that the reason that the Christmas has to do something with Christ from the perspective of believers. Well, I just came from Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Borneo, Macau, Hong Kong, Singapore, and everywhere I went, Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas. But it was devoid of what we as believers would say is the reason for the season. But let me then turn that, Rufina, to add value to what you've said. I'll talk fast, so listen fast. The reason for the season of the long summer break was to plant, cultivate, and harvest. So the long summer break was made to do what three things? Plant, cultivate, and harvest. That reason doesn't exist anymore. So if you come from poverty, you lose 6 weeks of everything you've learned. You lose 2 months of everything you learned during the regular academic year, and it's going to take 6 weeks to catch up. So when the people of Guam graduate, and if you're in politics, listen, because some of you are. We need to figure out how to educate our kids during the long summer break, and we need parents. I'd be happy to team up with a group to create a program called Guam Loves to Read, so that we can grow the intelligence of our children and critical thinking of our children. Because what happens is to our children is that when they graduate from high school, only 14% of high school graduates on Guam are reading at grade level. So the first thing that happens to you if you get a diploma, when you get a diploma, and you go to Guam Community College, the first thing they do is they give you a test and find out that you can't read, that you can't compute, that you can't write at the level of the college stuff. So you've experienced social promotion. And we need to put a stop to that, and parents can put a stop to that if you become conscious. There's a little clip that you should see. What is it, Laura? David, on the issue? Bryan Williams. There's a little clip. It's 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Bryan Williams. It's on YouTube. Bryan Williams, Summer Learning Loss. We need to look at it, and then we need to take action. I challenge every parent here to watch that Bryan Williams on YouTube, Summer Learning Loss, and let's figure out a way to create a ministry, a sacred, passionate intervention to make sure that our children do not feel the trauma of getting a diploma and then experiencing rejection and failure, because the diploma doesn't mean what we think it should mean. And it's in that spirit that we need to do that.
One more minute.
Un minuto más. These two, these are TED Talks. You can go in, and Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, 60 minutes long, and Dr. Stephanie Covington, a little longer, but these are wonderful. These are some of the books that are there that deal with the issue of trauma. Caramba. Restoring Trauma and Recovery. On and on. Beyond Addiction. Leaving Emotional Abuse and Other Forms of Abusive Relationships. The average medical doctor spends 18 seconds listening to you before they interrupt with some kind of a recommendation. Imagine if you don't even know the language. The average, I train people in medical schools to deal with social ways of looking at things, and that's a real issue. This book changed my life, Man's Search for Meaning. A psychiatrist from Austria in a death camp loses his whole family and has to find meaning. I read that book and I stopped feeling sorry for myself. These are the resiliency memoirs that girls and boys should read. And in the process, we can build hope. This happens to be our email. Souder@betances.com, S-O-U-D-E-R. That's Dr. Souder, Laura, my wife. Her book is out there that she wrote for kids. You're going to love it. And mine, Samuel@betances.com. If we can be of help, call the MARC Area Research Center, or be in control with us, and we will do what we can to add value to our beloved Guam and the Micronesian region. Thank you very much.
Samuel Betances. Okay, are you sure where are you from again?
Huh?
Where are you from?
Puerto Rico.
Not, he's very, what do they call it? Portuguese. Okay, so I wanted, I get permission.
I hope this doesn't go on YouTube.
Oh, it's going on YouTube.